Welcome to Be Provided Conservation Radio, everyone. I'm your host, Marcia Civic. Today, my guest is Mark Weston. Mark was sent to live on a remote island in the Tanzania half of Lake Victoria, where he found a community grappling with one of the world's great unknown environmental crises. In his new book, The Saviour Fish, Life and Death on Africa's Greatest Lake, he tells the story of this environmental catastrophe through the experiences of the people on Ukerewe Island. He lived on the island for 2 years and was able to create long-lasting friendships and gain trust of the community. As Mark says, the book is not all doom and gloom about the bad state of the fishing industry. The book is also about people, their religion and beliefs, and rural island life. Mark and his wife became part of the community and formed lifelong friendships. Mark states it was a privilege to get to know these people and their way of life. I'm happy to announce that The Saviour Fish was one of the Daily Telegraph's and Wanderlust magazine's travel book of the year for 2022. In today's episode, Mark first describes a bit about his experiences with the people and the island. Then we get into the environmental crisis about the Nile perch, also known as the Saviour Fish of Lake Victoria, how the crisis became to be what it is today, and how it all started. Mark was able to go out with a friend who also happens to be an illegal fisherman and tells us a small portion of his experience fishing with his friend. We end the interview on a lighter note discussing, of all things, banana beer. So enjoy the show and enjoy the book. The Saviour Fish is available through John Hunt Publishing, Amazon, and hopefully your local bookshop. The publisher's link to the book is in my show notes, along with some island photos and more information about Mark. I hope you enjoy our conversation and the book as much as I did. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the show, Mark Weston, and thank you for taking time to talk to me and my audience today about your recently published book. And it is called The Saviour Fish, Life and Death on Africa's Greatest Lake. That would be Lake Victoria. So yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, all the way from London, and I'm in California, so it's nice to have this technology to chat. My initial research of I can never pronounce Ukerewe. Is that
Ukerewe?
Ukerewe. Okay. And that's an island in Lake Victoria off the coast of, is it Mwanza in Tanzania?
Yeah.
Some of the descriptions that I read, it's scary, rough and tumble. It seemed like, I don't know if I would have the nerve to visit. There, you hear about rabid dogs, witchcraft, crime, but then I also read some good things too. It's great for birding. I think there's more tourist operations going there now, and it's a refuge, which I had no clue about, for albinos, the Tanzania population of albinos. I read, I believe, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that you had a little bit of a breakdown when writing a book about West Africa prior. So is there a little bit of PTSD moments getting there?
Yeah, I was worried about it because that was, I don't know, 5 years before or something. I'd been in West Africa, and just the massive stress that you go through traveling around somewhere like West Africa, or can go through. We were traveling around on a low budget and about as stressfully as you could possibly travel around. But it ended up getting to me after quite a few months. So I was worried that would happen again back in Tanzania when we were due to live on this island for 2 years. And we'd never heard of the island either. And hadn't been to East Africa, let alone Tanzania, let alone Lake Victoria. And all the stuff we could find on the internet about the island was about rabid dogs and witches and crime. And that was partly because there isn't much on the internet about Ukerewe. It's not a famous island. Actually, hardly any tourists do go there really. And our Swahili was at that time quite limited. We were ignorant, and we were mostly looking at pictures. And there was pictures of piles of rabid dogs on this jetty, which had obviously been killed because they were rabid. And the photo was juxtaposed with another photo of some guy, some woman whose arm had been almost cut off by what looked like a dog bite. So things like this slightly worried me, but it turned out to be a lot. We loved it in the end. I absolutely loved it. It's probably my favourite place in the whole world now. And spending the first few weeks were hard. Not having electricity and water almost ever was pretty difficult. And being the only kind of foreigners on this island where hardly anyone speaks English was pretty tough at first, but you get used to it and toughen up. And I didn't end up having any psychological problems while I was there at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I I loved it. And then when I left, I felt more depressed than I had when I was there, and been back to visit several times since. And yeah, it's a fantastic place. It is very good for birding. The lake's beautiful. It should have more tourists than it does, but it hasn't really got facilities. There aren't really hotels, but they're very down market, run down hotels, don't bathe themselves. Now the running water's better than it used to be, and the electricity supply is better than it used to be, but yeah, they're not salubrious. They're pretty tough traveling place.
I was wondering about traveling there and TripAdvisor and stuff, people visiting there. I was always wondering how they do it, because in your book you mentioned that there's only so much power throughout so many hours of the day, or the running water issue, people are bathing in the lake.
We had running water when we got there for about an hour every evening for the first few weeks, and then that cut off and we ended up not having running water almost ever. So we would pay a guy who used to have a trolley that went to main settlement, small town, and he'd go to a well and fill up jerry cans with water from the well and sell them to people in their houses. So we would buy that. But most of our neighbours couldn't afford that, or didn't really feel they needed it, would bathe in the lake, which isn't very clean or hygienic, and it's a big risk of bilharzia, tiny risk of things like hippo and crocodile attacks. And it's just not very clean. They get some of their drinking water from the lake and they generally boil that, so that's okay. But we could buy drinking water in bottles, so that was safe. But we used the water this guy brought around for washing up and showering and cleaning and things like that. So yeah, that was quite tough. The electricity supply is much better now than it was when we were living there, which was a few years ago. There's still pretty regular power cuts. It's difficult to get a cold beer because the fridges are never powered for long enough to keep it cold. There are quite a few bars there, and getting there is not that easy because it's a 4-hour, 3.5-hour ferry ride from Wanzo.
Oh, is it? And from the map, it doesn't look.
Yeah, not necessarily that safe. You get ferry disasters quite often on Lake Victoria. So,
I've read about a few just in the last couple of years. So
yeah, there was one off Ukerewe, in fact, between Ukerewe and the next biggest island on the archipelago a couple of years ago. Several hundred people died.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were there fairly recently, you said a few years ago. What years?
2015. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then we've been back a few times since, just to visit.
Nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I was going to ask, like, any time with some of these challenges with you and your wife, did you ever have a moment first getting there? What are we doing? Should we just turn around and leave? How close were you ever close to picking up and leaving, or just?
No, we couldn't, because she had a work contract
Okay.
on a teacher training project there. There's a teacher training college on this island, and she had to work there for at least 1 year. And we had the extent. Her contract was 2 years, but you could leave after a year. So it would have been really difficult to leave. And no, it didn't actually cross our mind. I pretty much loved it straight away. I loved being in this sort of informal settlement kind of area surrounded by Tanzanians who would somehow have to work out how to communicate with us. We studied Swahili and gradually and quickly got quite good enough at Swahili. So no, I liked it straight away. I thought it was an amazing adventure, and it felt like that all the way along. And it felt quite good to be able to withstand all the difficulties. It was almost like a badge of honor having no water. Sometimes I was a bit disappointed when the water came back, because I'd been feeling quite tough for having toughed it out, the fact that we hadn't had water for 3 weeks, nor hadn't had electricity for 2 days. So yeah, some sort of masochistic fun element to it. So no, we didn't really know. We were already, as I say, we were pretty disappointed when we had to leave at the end of the project.
Yeah, it's like a bragging factor. Oh, I can live this way. I know it. It builds character. Yeah.
And really, once you live in those conditions like that, you can probably live in most conditions. We moved to Sudan a couple of years after that.
Okay.
And that was really easy in comparison, even though Sudan is a pretty difficult country. We were in the city in Khartoum, but yeah, dealing with things like 45-degree heat when there's no power to run your fan or air conditioning or whatever, that was fairly straightforward after 2 years on the island with virtually nothing really.
Yeah, you learn how to slow down a bit too. I bet getting into some place like London, I bet can seem a little bit busy and no personal space as much, fast moving.
Yeah, people walk much faster.
Yeah, in fact, we on the train now. Yeah.
yeah, London. Yeah, people don't live in a tower block in London, and our neighbours, if we get in the lift with them, they don't say hello. Whereas in Ukerewe, people would come round in the morning to greet us and see if we survived the night okay. I mean, in the old days, it would literally have been to see if people had survived the night, but now it's a kind of tradition. Just say good morning to you, and we're good friends with quite a few of our neighbours still, and I call them up every couple of months and speak to them. So yeah, London's pretty difficult. But even within Africa, I remember we went to Zambia once just for a break from Tanzania, and we were walking in the capital, Lusaka. And in Tanzania, we usually overtook people when we were walking the streets. In Zambia, people were overtaking us. So Zambians even walk quite a lot faster than Tanzanians, and Londoners walk a hell of a lot faster than either of them. So yeah, countries seem to have different walking speeds, was one thing I discovered. And Ukerewe is slower still than, for example, Mwanza, which is a big city, or Dar es Salaam. So yeah, you slow down and get to take pleasure in slow existence and little things.
Yeah, it's nice. I think it would be nice to be unplugged for a little while too, if you don't have that, the electricity. Did you ever fear for your life? Or did you have any really scary moments? Like you said, you took a break and traveled. Were you worried that your place would have been ransacked and robbed?
Yeah, because we were the best off people on the island. We weren't very well off, but everybody else was much poorer than us. It's a poor part of Tanzania. And our house wasn't smart, it was a little bungalow, but we lived in it. White people lived in it. So it's obvious that when we went away, we would leave our stuff there, and we had more stuff than most other people on the island. We didn't have much, but so yeah, we assumed it would be a target to be burgled while we went away. Came back to Europe, for example, for a couple of weeks, or went to places like Zambia. But no, that never happened, and we think it's because our neighbours kept an eye on it for us. So if anyone had tried to break in, they would have stopped them or seen them, and that's what we were told. Another neighbour of ours, who's a big witchcraft believer, thought it was because of witchcraft that we weren't burgled, because the guy who built our house, his mum was apparently one of the most powerful witches on the island, and she, when he built it, would have put some kind of potion or something in the foundation stones to protect the inhabitants of the house. So this neighbour of ours said, that's why you haven't been burgled. It's not because your neighbours are looking out for you, it's because the witchcraft has protected you and anyone who lives in this house against things. So it's a different interpretation of it.
Interesting. I know, I find this also fascinating. Did you have any other experiences with witchcraft personally, where you questioned, did you believe it going in, or did you have a moment where you're like, wow, this could have been witchcraft, or any situation like that?
I'd come across it in West Africa quite a lot, and I didn't believe it. I liked the stories, or they're very creative stories, and about the way witches worked. But no, so I didn't believe in it at all. But I now understand why you can believe in it, because when we were quite early on in our stay, I think an owl or something landed on the roof, and it was hooting on our roof, and it was a tin roof, and you could hear it, and it woke us up, and we shooed it away, waving out the window or something. And the next day, my wife used to go to work by taxi, because it was quite a long way away and there's no public transport, so this taxi guy would take her, and she told him about this owl keeping us awake at night, and he said that would have been, he was like terrified. He said that must have been sent by a witch, and that means that an owl can signify death, as it can in lots of cultures, and you've got to be careful for the foreseeable future, because someone's trying to curse you, and when you tried to scare it away, that made it even worse. And I shrugged at it, but I got to thinking that if something bad had happened to us in the next few days, an accident, one of us had fallen over or got sick, and these things happen all the time on Ukerewe. There's lots of illness around, people have accidents, people are poor, so bad things happen to them. If anything like that had happened to us, which it easily could have done, I wouldn't have thought it's because of witchcraft, but it would have certainly come into my mind that we were supposed to have been cursed, and the neighbours will obviously think that, the curse did happen. Yeah, I've been brought up in an environment, in a culture where nobody believes in witchcraft, and it's a ridiculous thing to think about. If you've been brought up in a culture where everybody believes in witchcraft, you're much more likely to associate the fall or whatever with the curse than I was. And even I would have considered, it would have gone through my mind, not for very long, and I'd have probably laughed it off. But so, and then I would have, if I did believe in it, I'd have told my neighbours what had happened, and I had this fall just after the owl had landed on my roof, and they would have believed more in the power of it, so that the idea of this power of witchcraft gets stronger like that. So I worked out why it happened. No, I still don't believe in it.
I know, it
I
is
wouldn't totally rule it out. I'm not 100% atheist about it.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I come from a science background, and when I come across people believing in certain things spiritual that may happen, it does make you question though. And that could have been. But then I always try to find the logical, scientific reasoning behind it too. But
if we got sick, it would have been because of drinking bad water, not because an owl had landed on
Right. Or he fell because there was a stone in the road or something.
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
that, yeah, I was just curious about that. And I know my podcast is mostly about wildlife and conservation, so I do want to talk about the Saviour Fish, but I was really
Right.
interested in just hearing how you got there.
Mhm.
And you went there to the island. Your wife had worked there for a 2-year contract for teaching. Did you go there knowing that you were gonna research something like the Saviour Fish?
No, not at all. No, I'm a kind of researcher and writer about international development. So that's what the interest in Africa is from that. So various international development issues, including the environment sometimes, but not very often. But no, I didn't know about the fishing problems before I went there. I thought I'd probably write stuff because I'd already written one book about West Africa. I thought maybe I could write one about rural East Africa, or at least write travel articles. I do write occasional travel articles and broadcasts for the BBC and things. But no, I didn't think I'd end up writing a book, and I didn't know anything about the fishing crisis, and I didn't think I'd get so close to my neighbours that I would be able to find out in great depth and detail about the crisis and really see how it was affecting people. No, not at all. But while I was there, it just became obvious that it was a big issue. It's the second biggest freshwater lake in the world. 25 million people depend on it directly for their survival.
So before we talk about what happened over time with the fisheries and how that all came about, can you paint us a picture a little bit of, because I believe that area was colonized, right? And did some of these issues come in when colonization happened? So what was it like there with the fisheries before some of these changes?
Before the colonizers came, first the area was colonized by Germany and then Britain. After the First World War, Britain took over. Most people were farmers. Most people around the lake and on the islands were farmers rather than fishermen. They only fished a few months of the year and only very artisanal, small scale fishing. Someone said there used to be so many fish in I think it was his father's day or his grandfather's day, that you could almost catch fish from the beach with your bare hands. There were so many fish there. And most of the fishing was from the beach, not going out on boats, little traps around the beaches, very sustainable. And yeah, they wouldn't catch much. They'd catch a bit and then go back to their farming, catch it when there were good seasons and things like that. And yeah, very low tech fishing techniques. And also there was a much smaller population there as well. So there's been a huge population boom in the last century or so. In Africa, there was really no pressure on the fish, and there was a multitude of different species of fish in the lake. There were 500 cichlid species, which are these little colourful fish, which are popular among collectors of tropical fish.
Aquariums.
Yeah, in aquariums, yeah. Lots of other fish like catfish and lungfish and things like that, and tilapia and things. Yeah, there was lots of variety of fish before the colonisers, the British colonisers, that sort of started to cause the problems.
Yeah, and so they introduced a fish, the Nile perch, correct? And that's when things started to go awry. And I believe I did read that there was a little pushback from some of the people there that they didn't originally like this fish as far as taste. They preferred like the tilapia or the catfish or whatever else they were catching. So how did this all come about? What started to happen?
The British wanted to make money out of the colony, make some cash out of the lake. So they wanted to turn what was a tiny scale fishing seasonal fishing industry into a proper fishing industry that would generate some money, including and hopefully some export earnings. So first of all, in the sort of 1920s, they introduced flat gill nets to the lake and better boats and better fishing techniques, and organised people into fleets so that they could fish the lake more efficiently. And that ended up, first there was a bit of a boom, a fishing boom, and money did start to come into the lake, but then lots of the native species went extinct because of overfishing. So that was around probably the 40s and 50s, that first crash happened. And then so they decided, the British thought, well, how are we going to revive the lake? After the Second World War, Britain needed money because it was broke after the war effort. So it needed to start making more cash from its colonies, or at least then not lose money from it. So they cast around for another idea, and they decided to introduce an alien species into the lake, which had success in other African lakes. It's called the Nile perch, or Sangara in Swahili, and it's found on the Nile River, of which Lake Victoria is the main source, but it had never been in Lake Victoria before that. So against the advice of some ecologists who said it was dangerous to introduce an alien predator into a fragile tropical ecosystem, which Lake Victoria is, it's quite a shallow lake, and Nile perch can grow to something like 5-6 feet in length.
Yeah,
voracious.
Huge pictures.
Yeah, people sometimes on their shoulders, and they're basically as big as they are. Not many. There aren't many of those around those big ones, but occasionally you get. So they introduced Nile perch to the lake in the 50s. And it took a while for it to gain a foothold in the lake. But when it did in the 70s, it started appearing in nets. And at this time, between sort of the first fishing boom, the end of that, and the kind of late 70s, the lake region had become much poorer because it didn't have fishing. And overpopulation meant that farming was no longer really economical because plots of land got much smaller as they were passed down between generations, and over farmed them, so the soil got worse, and deforestation didn't help with the soil quality either. So yeah, in the late 70s, the perch started to appear in nets. By this time, the British had gone because Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya, the three countries around the lake, had gained independence. So the British never benefited from the introduction. Yeah, and at first, people around the lake didn't like the fish. It was fatty, and they thought it was bland compared to some of the native species and the smaller species, including some of the cichlids. I think government officials went around showing them how to smoke and cook this fish to make it more palatable and easier to cook. It was difficult to cook, it was big and fatty. But yeah, gradually their taste changed and they came to like it, and it came to save the economy around the region. It created a lot of jobs, 250,000 jobs just in the fishing industry. And lots of people also serve the fishing industry.
Wow.
And then it became known as the Saviour Fish because it had basically saved a lot of people from starvation. It generated export earnings. It was exported to places like the Middle East, like Israel, Europe, and Asia. Fish processing factories were built around the lake with support from people like the World Bank. And yeah, airports were built to fly it out to big cities within Africa and outside Africa. So lots of money came in, lots of cash started to slosh around the lake zone, and things went pretty well for a while in the sort of late 70s, 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. So the Saviour Fish. So ironically, it is called the Saviour Fish, and I'm sure you're gonna explain what happened as another downfall or bust with that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so things really built up because of this fishing industry, and so that brought a ton of people in. So what happened after that?
Yeah, too many people came in. Fishermen came in from all over Africa, over East and bits of Central Africa. There were like 2,000 new boats being launched onto the lake every year in this during this boom. And they were using more efficient motors, faster motors, nets, better nets with smaller kind of hole sizes, so it's easier to catch things. Trawlers were on the lake, and there was also a lot of pollution. So lots of other people came to kind of service the fishing industry. So factories around the lake that weren't just dealing with fish, but dealing with other stuff. Farmers came along so they could supply food to the fishermen. So there was more deforestation. So as well as the natural population boom from better kind of health care and better diets, there was also a population boom from more people descending on the lake from other parts of Africa. So deforestation, overgrazing of the soil, and that allowed nutrients and chemicals, pesticides and things from the farms to go into the lake. More sewage was in the lake. So there was a lot of the lake became dirtier, harder for fish to live in, but also the fish were getting overfished. So there was basically a crash in the numbers of Nile perch and in the size of Nile perch were caught. But also, before that happened, the cichlid species, 500 of them, as I mentioned, all sorts of different colours and size, mostly small, loads of them had disappeared. So something like 300 of the 500 species were thought to have gone extinct, or estimated by scientists to have gone extinct during that time, during the boom. Yeah, it's the biggest mass extinction of vertebrates in recorded history, apparently, according to one scientist. But yeah, and that was partly because of the pollution. It was partly because they were getting eaten by Nile perch, and it was partly because they were outcompeted for food by Nile perch. Nile perch is a very fast swimmer and ate a lot of the cichlid's food as well. So they disappeared from the lake, and therefore the Nile perch had less to eat, and the Nile perch were getting fished. There's lots of vicious circles going on. And the Nile perch were getting overfished, and the pollution was turning bits of the lake into dead zones. So you get these big fish die-offs where you see loads of you still get dead fish floating on the surface because they run out of oxygen because of the called eutrophication of the lake, which relates to this to pollution. And bits of the lake are deoxygenated and not fit for life anymore. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, which has contributed to crashing the number of fish the average fisherman catches in a night.
So now the economy is tanking there. Yeah,
absolutely tanking. Yeah, and nobody really knows what to do about it.
Yeah, and it brings in, you're trying to feed your community and your family, and you have more and more people fishing, and this brings me to, you have illegal fishermen, and
Yeah.
I believe I read in your book that you actually got to experience going out with some illegal fishermen. What was that like, and how do they feel about what's going on?
Yeah, so our neighbour, a guy called Hassani, after a few months, I think, a couple of months of living there, I realised that he was an illegal fisherman. He told me, but it took a while for him to tell me. And that one thing the governments of the lake have done is clamp down on this technique called beach seine, which is a pretty destructive fishing technique where two teams of men stand in a row on the beach and they drape a huge net out in the lake from the beach. And then the net can be the size of a couple of football pitches. And then they pull it in from the beach. The two teams of men pull each side of the net in from the beach. And as that gets pulled in and gets near the shore, it grazes the seabed, the lake bed, and catches pretty much anything in its way. And Nile perch breed in the shallows, and they rear their young for a while in the shallows. So that caught a lot of breeding mothers and young Nile perch, that technique. So that's been banned. Trawlers were also banned a long time ago, but it took a while for them to actually disappear from the lake. They were more destructive, but trawler owners were better connected than these beach seiners. They're the kind of bottom of the kind of food chain. These beach seiners are the poorest people. They can't afford boats to go out into the deeper waters and catch Nile perch with lines. They use these nets from the shore. So that's been banned around the lake. But Hassani, my neighbour, it varies, has 5 or 6 kids.
Varies?
Yeah, he has a group of his own kids living with him, and then he often has brothers' kids who come to stay for a long time. Or I think one of his brothers died, so he adopted one of those kids, and then one of his wife's brothers also died, so they adopted one of his kids as well. So yes, generally it varies, and then sometimes his kids some of them are getting a bit older now, so they go off to work and then come back. Anyway, he has about 5 or 6 young kids to look after at any one time. And they have a tiny plot of farmland as well, which they get some food from. But their only income, and the only thing he's trained to do, he's 51 now, is fishing. He wasn't educated. He came from the mainland, from near Mwanza to the island to take advantage of the boom. And that's all he knows. So although it's banned and he risks his net being confiscated and all his income taken away, there's nothing else he can do. So if he doesn't do that, he has no income. You don't have unemployment benefits in places like Ukerewe or even in Tanzania. So if his kids fell sick, which they would be more likely to because they haven't got as much food, they wouldn't be able to afford healthcare. And the healthcare on the island is pretty terrible anyway. So they would die. And that's what he says. If you give me an alternative, retrain me or something, maybe I could do something else. But if I stop doing this now, I have nothing else to do and my kids will die, either of starvation or of illnesses linked to malnutrition, which they will inevitably face. And the government doesn't provide any alternatives. It's a totally stick approach and no carrot.
Wow. Yeah, that's tough. Yeah. It's a tough position to be in for your friend. And
and there's hundreds of thousands of people like that around the lake doing the same thing. And they have to do it. He does it at night because the patrols don't usually come out at night because they're afraid, because they occasionally get attacked by groups of fishermen on the beaches. So he goes out at night, and I went out with him one night to see what it was like. And it's a really tough way to make a living. His hands are just scarred with white marks because of all the times he's pulled in ropes over the years. And it takes about an hour to pull in one of these nets because they're big and heavy and they're draped out a very long way. And it's exhausting. And they do this 7 or 8 times a night. It looks really boring, but I asked him, isn't it boring? He said, God's given me work. I'm happy to have work. He's Muslim. So attribute it to Allah. And
worth the sacrifice. Yeah, feed all those mouths. That's hard. Yeah, that's a tough life. Let's see. Are there any other opportunities to bring in besides fishing? You said the pasture lands are all used up. The soil's bad. Is there any movement to bringing back some farming, helping improve some of the soil, or teach people how to do any kind of farming to give an alternative to fishing?
Yeah, not that I've come across. Not that I've come across in my time in Ukerewe. Once there was a guy there who was French guy, I think, came over, or Italian. French, I think, who came over to try and introduce fish farming. So in Kenya, on the mainland, quite a lot of people have fish farms to try and take the pressure off the lake, and they put tilapia in these fish farms and export those, and that seems to go quite well. And this guy came to the island and got involved with the local businessmen and went around the island, touring around the island to try and persuade fishermen to do fish farms instead of fishing. So that would require digging a pit on the mainland, on the land in the island near the lake, and filling it up with it. I think the World Bank was sponsoring this program and trying to promote it. And they insisted on you having, it couldn't just be Hassani, my neighbour, and his family doing it. He would have to do it with at least 4 or 5 other fishermen, so that, and the World Bank's rationale is that then you get 4 or 5 fishermen off the lake instead of 1 off the lake, and reduce the fishing pressure that way. So I met this guy and told Hassani about it, and he was interested in the idea. And we went along to meet him and had a chat. And I could tell he just, after the chat, he was completely gone off the idea. And the reason was that this stipulation that he had to have 4 or 5 other people, he said he couldn't trust anyone. There was no one he could trust to not steal from the fish farm, from the pond. Someone would have to guard it at night, or when Hassani couldn't guard it in the daytime when everyone's shifts. And he couldn't trust someone not to tip off a thief or allow a thief to come and take some of the fish and get a cut from it, or just sell the fish himself. And I think that's a function of society having broken down on the island. It used to be very communal living. So in the old days, people would, when they got their few fish from the lake, from near the beaches before colonization happened, they would take them to the village chief, and they would be shared among the village, so that the person wouldn't even get the fish for himself. He'd just get a bit of the fish, a bit of the catch. Whereas now, because of the economic collapse, trust has broken down on the island, and it's much less of a rural idyll than it sounded like it used to be before. Obviously, it wasn't a totally rural idyll before. There were problems and wars and things, but there was a much more communal ethos than there is now. There's now much more surviving, fight for survival. So it's kind of dog eat dog. And yeah, when we were there, people stole. He was trying to build a house, or get enough bricks to build a house, and people would steal his a pile of bricks outside his house that he'd made from sand and water and clay, sand from the lake and clay and stuff. And people had stolen these bricks, and he was pretty sure it was one of the guys he used to go out with as part of his crew. So even one of his closest friends stealing from him. And we had lots of stories of petty crimes that were probably perpetrated by people around, people that people knew.
Wow, that's hard. That's really hard. Yeah, and he can't, unfortunately, it's hard for him to be able to go, like you said, to the mainland for work. And what other bottlenecks are there to stop some of the efforts to bring this community to, I don't know what you want to say, not a normal, but to a better standard?
Yeah, there's
not so broken. Yeah.
There aren't really any jobs in that part of Tanzania. I mean, everything was abandoned for the fishing industry. So now there's nothing else really, apart from hawking in markets and that. But then there's not much money now because there's no fish getting exported. So there's not much money in the market. So even having a market store is a pretty tough way to make a living. Lots of people just leave and try and go to the big cities and try and Dar es Salaam, which is the main city, which is on the coast. Lots of people go there and try and make some kind of living there. And there are more opportunities there. So there's a bit of an exodus from the island. And I think when you speak to 50-year-olds like Hassani, he says, I don't want my kids to be fishermen. I want them to get off the island and try and get work somewhere else. But sometimes that requires a good education, and the Tanzanian education system is terrible. I think it's almost deliberately made terrible so that people won't question the government and won't question corruption. I know that sounds cynical. I've never thought that before. I've never agreed before that governments would deliberately de-educate their population or make them less educated. But being in Tanzania for 2 years and then another year I had living in Dar es Salaam made me actually think that it was a deliberate policy to stop people being educated. So they try and get people to school because that gets grants from the World Bank and stuff. So school enrollment rates have gone right up, but the quality's got worse, according to people like the UN and UNDP and World Bank and stuff. And that's because they're not interested in educating their people.
Wow, that's sad. That's kind of an old.
Rather, they were uneducated.
You hear that story in older stories, older cultures. They want to keep the masses tame and dumbed down a little bit. Yeah. How was the experience with your wife? Can you talk about that?
Yeah.
Like with teacher training, and it seems like that kind of education would be helpful.
Essentially, the project was to do with the British government. I think it was funded by the British government. And there's 35 teacher training colleges around Tanzania, a lot of them are in remote places. And the idea is to go in and train the teacher trainers there in more interactive teaching techniques. So at the moment, the teacher stands at the front of the classroom and dictates to the kids, and they have to basically learn everything by rote. So they don't end up being able to think at all creatively or critically, deliberately. Yeah. So the idea was that these teacher trainers mostly from Britain, would go in and try and inculcate more interactive teaching methods so that the kids would get something out of the classroom rather than just having memory tests every so often in exams. So potentially it was good, but it was not a very well managed project. So colleges weren't prepared for this beforehand. So a lot of the teacher trainers in the colleges resented this foreigner coming in and telling them what to do, because they'd been teaching and being teacher trainers for years, and suddenly this foreigners coming in telling them, oh, what you're doing is not teaching the kids anything, you need to do it like this. And most of them were quite resentful of it, and it also meant more work for them, because they had to go along to these sessions as well as doing their own classes, and they weren't really interested in learning anything new anyway, because they could easily get by in their jobs just doing it as they were. It was much easier for them, and they never get any naughtiness from the students, because the students are just silent the whole time, and the teachers are very strict. Whereas if it's interactive, they could see it's harder to control the student. So they weren't really interested in learning, and they weren't really getting any benefit from it, because they had the job. They weren't going to lose that job as a job for life. So it was a bit of a failure of a project, to be honest. In fact, there'd been a similar project about 20 years before, we found out while we were there, by the same organisation. So they're just repeating the same thing 20 years later. This is this happens quite a lot in international development.
Yeah, that's hard. Did your wife have any success story at all that she can, at least one person or two people?
Yeah, a couple of people. Yeah, so I think her class sizes were 20 teacher trainers or something like that, and one or two of them she managed to bring round to these more interactive methods. Whether they're still using them, we don't know, but if they are, it can have a big impact, because their classes so they were training teachers, so their classes of teachers would be 100 teachers in a class or 80 teachers in a class. So if one teacher trainer can train 80 or 100 teachers to become more interactive and better teachers, and those teachers themselves have class sizes of at least 100 kids or 80 kids or 70 kids, then you can, just by converting one person, you can make a big impact on lots of kids.
Yeah,
it's just whether that person carried on with these methods after the project finished, we don't know.
Yeah, you haven't been able to follow up, has she? Yeah,
it's hard. Yeah, once these projects finish, they just get forgotten about generally.
Yeah, interesting. Do you have any? Oh, I'm sorry.
Once the money stops coming in, people just forget about it.
Yeah, exactly. So do you know how many children are able to make it off the island to go to a university elsewhere or somewhere to get further education? Has that number ever come up?
Pretty miraculous if you hear of a kid going to university from the island.
Wow. Yeah.
I know one guy who went, but that's because he was funded by some Canadian doctors to go study a diploma somewhere. Some Canadian doctors come there every year to run clinics, and he was there working for them as a translator, because he speaks a bit of English. And they funded him to do a diploma, but now he's back on the island. He hasn't got a job because there aren't any jobs. Wow. So yeah, it's more about going to the cities to become hawkers or things like that, rather than get professional jobs or get totally out. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's tough. Back to the lake ecology. Have you seen any other work? Are there conservationists, ecologists coming in trying to improve what's going on with Lake Victoria at all? There must be, maybe in Uganda and Kenya more so than Tanzania. You don't see a lot. In Tanzania, there's not much going on in, for example, Mwanza, which is a big city right by the lake, the biggest Tanzanian city on the lake. You don't really see NGOs there working to improve the lake. Kenya, there's a couple I've heard about, but no, it doesn't seem to be a big concerted effort to fix it. And partly that's because there are 3 countries around the lake. So Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania, which don't always get on very well with each other. So it's a common resource, but if Tanzania bans all fishing on the lake, then Kenya and Uganda will benefit from having all the fish to themselves, kind of thing. So you need cooperation between the 3 countries, and that hasn't really been forthcoming and is unreliable. Yeah, that's a tough one to overcome. Yeah. I think the bans are having some effect though. The bans on these illegal fishing techniques do seem to be having some effect, because some of the cichlids are coming back. I think a few of the species that just hadn't been seen in nets for decades have now reappeared and are starting to recover a bit. And there's some hybridization between cichlid species, which seems to be, in some cases, successful in creating new hybrid species, because the water's so murky in some cases, the females can't see the males, and so they end up mating with males of slightly different cichlid species. And sometimes that produces offspring, and sometimes that offspring can reproduce. So through hybridization, I think the numbers of cichlids seem to be at least stabilizing. Yeah, and the number of large perch, I think, might not be going down so much. Although when I went there in March last year and went to the market in Wandsworth, the price of Nile perch has been rocketing up because of the scarcity. So it's probably Nile perch numbers are still going down, even if certain other species are stabilised. But you don't get the big Nile perch that you used to get, and get smaller ones.
Wow.
Sounds like a really depressing story, this. But there's lots of good stuff that happens on the island as well. The people are amazing, and there's lots of, it's not just social breakdown. There are, people do look out for each other when things are bad. People steal from each other. But when disasters happen, people rally round in an amazing fashion. Like our neighbour, one of our neighbours, who is an ex-fisherman, he was about 55. While we were there, he died of complications from bilharzia, which is a snail-borne disease that you can catch in the lake, and it messes up your spleen and things in the long term. If you don't get treatment, it's easy to treat, but most people can't afford to get treatment, or don't know that they need to get treatment. He died while we were there, and he has several kids. And his funeral, he was like the poorest of the poor, really poor family. There was probably 300 people came to his funeral, and lots of them stayed for days, like sleeping on the grass outside his house, just to show solidarity with his wife and his kids and his family. People would come from distant villages, other islands on the lake. It's incredible display. I mean, I'll never have 300 people at my funeral. I'll be happy if I have 30, but he had 300.
Amazing.
Yeah, and
so community comes together.
Yeah, and everyone would bring something. So the people bring like a big bowl of rice or something like that, paddles to stir the rice, fishing boating paddles to stir the rice, and then the poorest people would just bring a few sticks that could be used for firewood, which was quite moving, seeing them bring at least something. Literally a few sticks that could be used for fires to cook the food to sustain these people over 6 days of the funeral. And they're at the actual burial. He was Muslim, and another of our neighbours was Christian, and he had some role in a small local church, and he officiated the burial. So the Christians and Muslims came together for this, and there isn't really any difference between Christians and Muslims. I mean, you can't really tell apart from their names who's a Christian and who's a Muslim. So there's no religious tension at all on the island, which is pretty amazing.
That is amazing. How many people are on the island? Is it like
nobody really knows? Probably there's an archipelago of Ukerewe itself. Is an archipelago, and the island that we lived on is the biggest one, which is also called Ukerewe, and there's about 28 islands. Nobody even knows how many islands there are exactly. It's not really. Some of them aren't even on Google Maps or Google Earth. And so about 250,000 on the whole archipelago is the most common estimate. So it's quite a lot of people. Yeah. Quite heavily populated, which is partly why there's not many trees left, and not much good soil left, and not many fish left.
Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah. Well, it sounds you said you've been back a couple times, so I figured there must be some good things that came out of that, and good friends. And I'm sure, are you welcomed with open arms to see your old friends? And
welcome. Yeah, incredible. Yeah, everyone can walk down the main street, and 6 or 7 people will come up to us every time and say hi that we haven't even seen for 8 years or 5 years or whatever. Yeah, everybody greets us and is delighted to. So we had a lovely welcome, and that's one of the reasons we go back. And we have probably more friends there than we do in any other single place in the world. Yeah, it's lovely welcome again, and people will invite you around for food, even though they haven't really got any money. Cook something for you. Yeah, incredible hospitality. Terrific. And there were lots of kids around our house when we were living there. So lots of our neighbours, everyone has loads of kids there. And we got quite close to quite a few of the kids. They used to hang around outside our house doing their homework and playing and stuff. And we'd play with them because I had more time than their parents who were busy working or doing household chores. So lots of them are growing up now, and it's quite nice to see them when we saw them when they were 3 and 2, and now there's 10 and 8 and things like that. And that's nice to see them growing up. And
Oh, that's wonderful. So I assume you're going to be going back whenever you can.
Probably every couple of years we've been back so far. If we can keep that up, that'd be great.
Yeah. Are you, any follow-up books in the works on what's happening from Saviour Fish to present and any of your visits over there? No,
because the problems I outlined in the Saviour Fish, which was from 2014, when we were there, 2014, 2015, are still the same problems, really. And
nothing's changed.
No.
Yeah. But
hopefully it will help raise a bit of awareness and start to wake people up to this problem, which is affecting so many millions of people.
Yeah, and it's not just the fish and the ecology of the lake, it's the health of the people, the communities. But I have a note here on a fun note to ask you about banana beer.
Oh,
What is that? Is that their form of alcohol on the island, or is there alcohol, I assume, on the island?
yeah,
Yeah.
quite a lot of alcohol on the island.
Okay.
It's easy. That's one thing that's quite easy to get. Lots of foods and stuff, like cheese, for example. Nobody's ever heard of cheese. So there's lots of food items aren't that easy to get. But yeah, alcohol is very easy to get. And yeah, banana beer is a traditional drink on the island. So from years back, there used to be lots of banana trees and plantations around the island. There aren't so many now because of crop diseases and stuff. Again, because of over farming.
Overfarming.
But I managed to track down one of the last remaining banana beer brewers on the island, who's this old guy who lives in this tiny village near them, quite near the main town, and it's his house. He brought in a few bottles to the market one day, and this guy I know who works in the market, I told him I want to get some banana beer if I can, because I'd read about it in some epic novel about Ukerewe, which was written in the 50s or something, which I'd read, and they talked about banana beer brewing process, which takes days in that. And he saw this guy selling the banana beer, and I actually bought a bottle from him for us to try. So I was delighted, and he rang me up, and I went into the market and sat with him at his market. So when we opened the bottle, and it just frothed out, everything just frothed out of the bottle. It had obviously been shaken up while this guy was cycling into town with it. So we ended up with a tiny amount of banana beer left. So we tried it. It was nice, but most of it was on the floor into the dirt floor. But then it took a while for him to come back, this guy. And then my friend got his number. So and said, next time you're brewing, which doesn't happen very often because it's dying out, this custom, and young people would rather drink beer or mass-produced spirits than banana beer. So he contacted him the next time he was brewing, and we went out to watch the process, and it involves plucking loads of bananas, burying bananas for a few days and smoking them in the kind of grave that they're in, the hole in the ground that they're in.
Oh, wow.
So you put them in a pit and smoke and leave and cover the pit and smoke them for 4 or 5 days, and then you get them out. And then the bit we watched was him in a fishing sort of canoe walking up and down on these bananas barefoot for hours and hours, getting
Smashing them.
Mashing them, basically getting all the juice out for hours. And then there's another few days of them fermenting, and then he comes up with the banana with the bottles, and he brought a few round. I bought some of it, and he brought some round to our house 5 days later or something like that for us to drink. And then we had plenty of it then. It's really lovely. It's a bit like apple cider, but tastes of banana.
Oh, so it's got a little bit of a sweetness, but it's carbonated too with the fermentation.
Slightly. Yeah. No, it's just delicious. Yeah, so we had that, but it's hard to find. Yeah,
you could probably drink it warm too, I would think, and have it still taste okay. Probably perfect for the island.
Yeah, we didn't have enough power for the fridge to keep it cool most of the time, so yeah, it was fine.
Were you able to bring any home and save any? And
no, I don't think you'd be allowed to do that.
Oh, that's true.
And I don't know how long it will keep. I'm not sure how long it will keep.
That's true.
Refrigerated, because it's kind of moving. You look at it in the bottle, and it's kind of moving all the time, and then stuff moving around in there. I don't know whether that's something to do with the fermentation process or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one of the highlights actually that day, watching him doing it and writing the notes of how long the process took, and they made us some food as well. He's really quite a poor guy, and they made us some food, and we had a meal there. And it's that kind of place that they have to show hospitality, even if they can only just afford to, or can't even afford to. But yeah, he was a lovely chap.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and they certainly can't turn down a meal from that kind of offer for sure.
No.
That would be, Your book is lovely. I really enjoyed the book. There's a lot about the fishing aspect that is sad and hard, but it was great to learn about your experience with these different people and what's going on there. So I hope our listeners do get the book. And the book is available through John Hunt Publishing, correct?
Yeah, and on Amazon and good book sites and things. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and it was just published almost a year ago, right?
Yeah, May last year, a bit less than a year. Yeah.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the book that maybe we didn't discuss, that let our listeners know something?
I think so. I think we've covered most of it here. But yeah, there is stuff on the environmental crisis, but there's also quite a bit that isn't. That's basically about rural life in Africa as well. So yeah, it's not just doom and gloom. It's about how people in a very rural part of Africa go about their daily lives, and hearing about what they think about things, and think about what they think about God, what they think about religion, what they think about the West and colonization and stuff. So it was a privilege to meet these people who I would never have otherwise met if I hadn't been forced to live there for 2 years. And if I had by chance gone to Ukerewe, I would have just gone through as a tourist and seen it for a couple of days rather than developing long-term relationships and friendships with people whose background couldn't be any more different from mine. So it's incredibly eye-opening and many points very humbling. It gives you a different perspective on the world. And also, slow living as well makes you appreciate little things because there's not much to do. There's no entertainment. So there's no cinemas or theatres or museums or anything. So it's just sitting around, maybe looking at birds, chatting with kids, chatting with your neighbours, going for little walks and things like that, looking at the lake, pondering the meaning of life and things. But it's an interesting, and it's very different to where I am now, which isn't very urban, inner city, central London.
Yeah.
Both have their merits, but it's good to experience both. I'd still much rather be there.
Yeah.
It's only because of COVID that we came back here because the airport closed and we had to get out before the airport closed for ages. So I'm looking for ways to get back to live in Africa somehow.
Yeah. And slow down. That part sounds ideal. Here in California, it's very crazy busy.
Yeah.
It's hard, but Thank you so much for writing such a great book and sharing your stories on that. And I think it's an important story that people need to hear and read about. So thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today's episode. And thank you again for listening. I hope you get a chance to read The Saviour Fish. Pictures and more information about Mark and John Hunt Publishing can be found in the show notes at beprovided.com. All pictures were provided by the author unless otherwise stated. Background music for today's show is from soundstripe.com and is titled Ngoni Nights by Kona Collective. Thanks again for listening to our show, and until next time, stay safe and stay healthy, everyone.